Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are going to completely shift your paradigm about what actually causes a natural disaster. We so often blame nature when catastrophe strikes, but the reality hidden in the data and the research tells a completely different and deeply human story. We're going to unpack the actual science of risk today, and I promise you, by the end of this, you will never look at a news report of a flood, a storm, or an earthquake the exact same way again.
Here's our quick roadmap for today. We'll be looking at redefining disasters and risk, the roots of vulnerability, coping versus adapting, the real-world dimensions of risk, an amazing case study on the Garifuna women, and finally, how we can actually build a resilient future. Let's dive right in.
We see extreme weather on the news all the time, right? But we really have to stop and ask ourselves, why does a hurricane completely devastate one region, literally flattening entire towns and causing a massive loss of life, while a storm of the exact same magnitude hits another place and causes just minor disruptions? Why do some communities bounce back in a matter of weeks while others take decades to recover? Well, the answer isn't in the wind speed, and it's not in the rainfall levels. The answer is actually in us. To really understand this, we have to recognize that a disaster is not just an act of nature. Disaster risk is a socially constructed reality. It's born directly from how human society interacts with its environment. The risk itself is basically a continuum. It's always evolving based on the decisions we make every day. The disaster is simply the moment when those unmanaged underlying risks finally materialize.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, Redefining Disasters and Risk. To truly grasp this concept, we need to break down the holy trinity of the disaster risk equation: hazard, exposure, and vulnerability.
The first variable in our equation is the hazard. Now, this is the actual physical event. We're talking the storm, the flood, the drought, or the earthquake. Often, these are completely natural events that we have absolutely no control over. Though, it's worth pointing out that human intervention, like environmental degradation, can actually create new socio-natural hazards, like altering flood regimes or triggering a landslide. But on its own, a hazard is just a physical phenomenon.
The second variable is exposure. This simply means having people, infrastructure, or economic resources physically sitting right in the path of that hazard. Think about it. If a massive magnitude 8 earthquake strikes an entirely uninhabited desert, well, it's an extreme hazard, but there is zero exposure, so there is no disaster risk. But because of population dynamics and our stubborn human tendency to build right on top of waterways and coastlines, we are increasingly settling in very hazardous areas.
And that brings us to the final and honestly the most critical variable: vulnerability. This represents the weaknesses, the marginalization, or the total lack of resources that make those exposed elements likely to actually suffer harm. Vulnerability is extremely situation-specific. For instance, a population might be highly vulnerable to a drought, but completely insulated from a financial crisis. It is the most palpable, real-world manifestation of how society constructs its own risk.
So here's the crucial takeaway. You can be exposed to a hazard without being vulnerable to it. Just imagine two different families living in the exact same dangerous floodplain. Both are equally exposed, right? But if one family has the wealth to build a reinforced home on stilts, they buy comprehensive insurance, and they have a car to evacuate early, they aren't highly vulnerable. The other family, lacking those financial means and social safety nets, is incredibly vulnerable. Exposure is necessary for a disaster for sure, but it is the vulnerability that determines the actual devastation.
Moving on to Section 2, the roots of vulnerability. Let's see how this builds our understanding of where these dangerous vulnerabilities actually come from. Because if they aren't created by nature, where do they originate?
The research unequivocally shows us that disasters highlight skewed human development. Vulnerability doesn't just spontaneously happen. It's driven by rapid and unplanned urbanization into hazardous areas, failed governance, and a severe lack of livelihood options for the poor. Think of this safe development paradox. Sometimes we'll build a massive levee to stop a river from flooding. But this structural defense creates a false sense of security, which just encourages more people to build homes in the floodplain. When that levee eventually breaches, and they often do, the resulting disaster is far worse than it ever would have been originally. We didn't solve the risk, we just masked it.
Section 3, Coping versus Adapting. When societies face these escalating risks, they rely on two very different types of capacities to survive. And understanding the difference between these two is vital for our future. We really need to draw a hard line here between coping capacity and adaptive capacity. Coping involves ex post actions, meaning after the fact. It's how you react to and survive a hazard that is already hitting you. It's your basic emergency response. Adapting, however, is ex ante, meaning before the event even happens. It requires anticipating the risk and fundamentally transforming your structures, your behaviors, or your locations so that you don't have to suffer the hazard's worst impacts in the first place. Coping is about mere survival, adapting is about proactive transformation.
Historically, the disaster management world focused almost entirely on coping capacity, the immediate humanitarian relief needed to save lives. But as we look at the scientific evolution of these terms, the focus has heavily shifted toward adaptive capacity. We're finally realizing that if we only focus on coping, literally just repeatedly rebuilding the exact same flawed structures in the exact same spot after every single storm, we are trapped in an endless cycle of maladaptation. True resilience requires both immediate relief and long-term adaptation.
Section 4. The Dimensions of Risk. Next, we look at the staggering real-world data that proves vulnerability is a human construct vastly differing across geographical and social lines.
The contrast between these numbers is literally mind-blowing. Research shows that, on average, a similar percentage of people are physically exposed to hazards in low human development countries compared to high human development countries. It's roughly 11% versus 15%. Yet, check out the mortality rate. Countries with low human development suffer 53% of the deaths, compared to just 1% in highly developed nations. Wealth, education, health systems, and governance drastically alter the deadly impact of the exact same weather events.
And the human toll goes way beyond just mortality. In just the year 2008 alone, an estimated 20 million people were displaced by rapid-onset climate-related disasters. This geographic and social disruption is massive. When individuals and communities lack the adaptive capacity to remain safely in their homes, they are violently uprooted, which sets off a horrific chain reaction.
Because displacement is rarely just a simple relocation, it is often a secondary disaster all on its own. According to the impoverishment risks and reconstruction approach, displacement subjects people to 8 systemic traumas. People lose their land and their jobs. They face homelessness, severe marginalization, and food insecurity. Their health declines rapidly. They lose access to common property resources like water and forests. And finally, social disarticulation occurs, meaning the networks and the community bonds they heavily rely on for survival are completely severed. The disaster continues long after the storm passes.
Section 5. Empowering the Garifuna women. I want to highlight this because vulnerable populations are not just helpless victims waiting around to be saved. They are active managers of their own risk, and recognizing their capacity is absolutely essential.
The Garifuna women of Honduras are just a brilliant example of grassroots resilience in action. They carry multiple markers of vulnerability. They are marginalized by gender, by ethnicity, and by poverty in a hazard-prone developing country. Yet, after the absolute devastation of Hurricane Mitch back in 1998, they didn't just cope, they adapted. They organized their own emergency committee. They went out and bought safer land for relocation, they built seed and tool banks, revived traditional methods of soil conservation, and even created farmers markets. They literally transformed their community's vulnerability into incredible adaptive capacity.
Which brings us to Section 6, Building a Resilient Future. So, what should you take away from this explainer when considering the future of our own local and global communities? How do we actually apply this science of risk?
Moving forward, managing climate-related information and disaster risk requires a systemic approach at every single level of society. Businesses and governments absolutely must audit their models and policies to ensure they aren't inadvertently increasing vulnerability. We have to strictly identify principal risks through rigorous environmental due diligence, and most importantly, we must purposefully shift our desired outcomes from short-term coping, just, getting through the next season, to long-term adapting that fundamentally secures our future.
We really have to remember the core lesson from all this research. The devastation of a natural disaster is usually the final, tragic result of unsustainable human decisions. It's the result of where we choose to build, who we choose to protect, and what inequalities we passively allow to persist in our societies.
I'll leave you with this final thought to chew on as you look at your own city or town. Is the new development happening in your own backyard merely treating the hazard by pouring more concrete, or is it actually treating the vulnerability by empowering the people? The storms are inevitable, but the disasters, those are a choice. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and stay curious.